so far when we've been using third-party APIs, all our API keys have been public. So they've been showing up on the front end of our apps, like in the views. They'd show up within our actual URL, which is okay because they're all public APIs. They're not going to harm anybody. But and sometimes we put the API key like directly in the URL, or we import it via settings, like I'm doing right now. So in our settings, this is the landmarks. So I've got my API key in settings right here. So when I like git commit or push this up to GitHub, all the settings are going to go with it, and now our API key is going to show up on GitHub, which is totally fine. This is a public API key. It's not going to do us any harm. People can't steal money from us or like use this API key to set up their own apps and like ruin our reputation or just like put us in a financial risk because they're public API keys. There's no harm to it. So that's why they currently show up on the front end. But as you continue to use APIs, you'll encounter like private API keys. So you have a public key and then you also have a private key to go along with it. And that private key is specific to authenticate you as a user, so you personally. So if you have an account at like Twitter and you use the Twitter API, you have a public API key to authenticate, like, or not to authenticate, but a Twitter API key to enable you to get tweets or something like that. But the private key is used to like authenticate you as a user, and that key should be private because if somebody gets a hold of that key, then they can authenticate you through Twitter or Facebook. Someone can use your private API key on Facebook and imitate you by building an application that posts on your behalf if they have that private API key. So using settings and putting our settings or our private API key in settings won't suffice. And those private API keys won't show up like in a URL like they do here for Google or Ticketmaster. Those private API keys will be used to run a method and talk to either Facebook server or Twitter server and to actually authenticate you as a user. So it won't show up on the front end, however, it will be in our source code, which if you push up to GitHub, it will show up. So in order to hide, for an example, hide like our Google API key, you can either store it on the instance of the server, so by doing like os.config, and then Google API. That's one way to do it. But if you're just using this app, we can create a separate config file. So I created this separate config file right here on the same level as the managed PY file. And I just created a variable Google API key and set it to the actual API. Now in our settings, we can import, import config. Is that what it is? Import config. Or from config, import Google API key. And now we can set that to our API. Where'd it go? Right here. Let's see if this works. And let's actually print this. Print Google API key, Google API key. And we still will import settings into our thing and grab the Google API key variable. And then our config, it's all good. Now let's just run this server. See right here, Google API key got printed right there. So now we have a config file that we have to deal with. So we don't want to push this file up to GitHub because this API key we maybe want to keep secret. So we can create a git ignore file which when you git commit and git push up to GitHub, it'll actually look to see if there's a git ignore file, and you can put in whatever files or folders you want Git to ignore, so when it's pushing up, it doesn't include those files. So this config file won't be pushed up to GitHub, or like the environmental variables won't be put up, or this virtual environment won't be pushed up. So when you create a git ignore file, and when you put files into this git ignore file or folders, notice how that like the name of the file is grayed out. That means it's not being pushed up. So if I delete the config file and I save it, notice how config is now, where is it? Now highlighted green, and then VNV is still grayed out. So I'm going to config.py, I'm saving it. There, it went like darker. Now let's see if this actually works. And our API key is still working. So you can create a git ignore file and a config.py file, and then you can export the config file or import it into your settings. Import config, or from config import Google API key, and then just set Google API key in the settings.